Good evening. In China, there's been a huge outpouring of grief and anger at the treatment of a doctor who tried to warn the world of the dangers of the coronavirus. Hundreds of millions of people have viewed social media posts on Dr. Wenliang, who's died after contracting the illness while treating infected patients. He was censored by the authorities in the city of Wuhan after raising the alarm back in December about the potential dangers of the virus. The government has now sent officials to investigate how he was treated. Well, as the coronavirus continues to spread, controls and restrictions are increasing right across China, where more than 600 people have now died and another 31,000 have been infected. From Beijing, here's our China correspondent, John Sodworth.
In some cities, those suspected of being sick are being rounded up, with multiple unverified videos showing the quarantine squads at work. It's all adding to a growing sense of disbelief and dread. I don't want to be taken away like that, a child can be heard saying. But now the fear is turning to anger. Dr. Wenliang was one of the first to report signs of the new strange virus. But his online posts were censored, and the police made him sign this confession, along with 7 others, for spreading rumours. His death from the virus in this Wuhan hospital has prompted an outpouring on social media. The hashtag #IWantFreedomOfSpeech viewed almost 2 million times before being blocked.
This week, the cover of The Economist was rather clever. It was a globe with a surgical mask in the form of the Chinese flag on it. Where are we right now in this? What are the economic effects likely to be?
Well, we don't really know, but my suspicion is that they are going to be quite a lot bigger even than those numbers that you cited. And let me tell you why. And I'm very struck how little reaction there has been in markets, particularly this week, where I think they basically kind of shrugged off any concerns about the coronavirus. And the reason I worry a bit is that the prism through which many analysts are looking at this is the prism of the SARS virus, which in 2002, 2003 hit China and parts of Asia. And the impact then was a very sharp decline in Chinese GDP, but very quick, and then a very dramatic bounce back the following quarter. So when you looked at it over a year, it was a kind of blip. I think there are several reasons why this time is different. One is, as you say, the numbers of people infected are already quite a lot larger. It's travelled further, and we aren't anywhere near the peak yet. We don't know how far we are from the peak.
Around the world are scrambling to find a vaccine against the new virus that exploded out of China. Just days after Chinese scientists shared the virus's genetic code, researchers at the National Institutes of Health were engineering a key vaccine ingredient. Their target is a spike-like protein on the virus's surface. NIH is working with biotech company Moderna to manufacture the vaccine.
It's a very rapid way of discovering new applications because it's all based on digital technology.
Injecting a piece of the virus's genetic code in a vaccine instructs cells to make the target protein. That puts the immune system on alert for the real virus. It's a newer and far faster way of making vaccines without using the virus itself.
We make this without living organisms. This is all a chemical process, nearly all of it. And so you can condense it and you can make it efficient in scale and in time relative to traditional ways of making vaccine.
Moderna is just one of several companies working on a vaccine in the United States. There are other efforts worldwide in places like Australia and France. At the Pasteur Institute in Paris, they're piggybacking on the measles vaccine, working to mix into it protection against the new coronavirus. Experts say the response from around the world has been swift.
This would be the fastest that I've seen movement from identification of a virus to generation of an approach to initial synthesis of a vaccine.
This is the third dangerous coronavirus to cause a surprise outbreak in 20 years, after 2 others named SARS and MERS. Experts say they don't believe it will be the last.
This week, obviously, is the spread of the coronavirus. A lot of talk about what the economic effects are. What do you make the economic effects out to be?
David, no one knows, but I think the risks are very large. Experience suggests that major pandemic events are events that take place somewhere between once every half century and once every century. The fact that this one has gone so far has to mean there's a substantial chance that it's the one for this half century or this century. And the events that take place that infrequently, the worst of them, kill a number of millions of people, and quite possibly as many as 10 million people. And they disrupt commerce and transportation and the ordinary doing of business, not for weeks, but for many months, or even a period approaching a year.
China is on a war footing. Unverified video on social media shows streets in Wuhan, where the virus originated, being sprayed with disinfectant. But questions linger over how China's government is dealing with this invisible enemy. Few countries can marshal the resources now at China's disposal, and that's the thrust of the narrative on state-controlled television. But hospitals are swamped with an acute shortage of beds. Gymnasiums and sports stadiums have been turned into temporary medical centres to cope with demand.
These really interesting kind of butterfly wing consequences. You know, coffee prices tumbling because all the Starbucks is being closed. You know, Chilean exports of wine.
Right, wine and cheese are piling up everywhere for the
We're going to see more of those because I think a lot of people aren't really. You know, I certainly am not aware of the very details of these supply chains. So there's going to be really surprising consequences. 90% of the world's plastic flowers made in China.
Is that right? I didn't.
SARS was a killer, both literally and economically. SARS, or severe acute respiratory syndrome, killed almost 800 people in 2003. It also knocked 2 full percentage points off China's growth. GDP rose 11.1% in the first quarter of 2003, but dropped to 9.1% in the second. SARS hurt China and its neighbors, but the country's relatively small weight limited the global economic impact. Back in 2003, China's GDP was 4% of the global total. Now it's 17%, which means any drop now will hit harder. Bloomberg economists have drawn up scenarios for the potential impact. The latest outbreak occurred during the Lunar New Year holiday, a peak time for consumption in China. And reduced spending won't be recouped. Current travel restrictions are also much wider than those imposed in 2003. So if the outbreak is contained quickly, growth that might be hammered in the first quarter could recover later in 2020. That would put full-year growth at 5.7%, 0.2% below Bloomberg's original forecast. But if the outbreak persists, the damage to growth would be more severe, and neighbors would be hit harder, especially in Hong Kong, South Korea, and Vietnam.
I'm not sure I like this globalization so much.
That's absolutely true. And I'm interested in this country. What happens? Let's just imagine, I hope it doesn't, but let's imagine this goes on for a few months. And let's say we have a bigger outbreak here in the US too. What is the president going to do in terms of his relationship with the Chinese leader and the reaction to China? Because on the one hand, if this is hurting the US economy a lot, it's going to be something made in China that's hurting the US economy, not so great. And it's also reinforcing this sense of division between the US and China. So I'm kind of interested, Glenn, what do you think? Where does that shape up?
Well, I think it certainly would feed the president's skepticism. But let's remember that the president's opponents in this race are as at least as skeptical as China, if not more so. In fact, he may be the China friend among them.